When we talk about what makes a villain work, the conversation almost always goes the same direction. How threatening are they? How evil? And those things matter, but they have never been what actually makes a villain stick with you after the credits roll, because that describes hundreds of characters you don't think about anymore. The ones you still think about, the ones that genuinely unsettled you in ways you couldn't fully explain as a kid and still can't fully explain now. Those villains had something else entirely. They had a point, and not just a point you could intellectually acknowledge from a safe distance, a point you felt somewhere uncomfortable because some part of you recognized it. Some part of you knew they weren't entirely wrong about the world. DreamWorks understood this before almost anyone else did in animation, and I think the reason they understood it is because DreamWorks was never really in the business of making safe films. Disney, at their best, makes you feel the warmth of belonging. DreamWorks, at their best, makes you feel the cold of what happens when belonging gets denied long enough. Their villains are what happens when someone real, with a real wound, makes the wrong choice about what to do with the pain. And that is a completely different kind of evil, because it doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from somewhere you've been. So I want to go through the DreamWorks villains that understood this most completely, the ones that weren't just antagonists to the hero's journey, but were parallel journeys of their own that went wrong in the most psychologically honest ways possible, and make the case that every single one of them was right about something. Not about their methods, but about the wound underneath the methods. And once you see that, you can never watch these films the same way again. The place to start, and I think the most underrated starting point in any conversation about DreamWorks, is Ramses from The Prince of Egypt. Most people think of The Prince of Egypt as a Moses film, and it is, but it is equally and just as precisely a Ramses film, and the reason it works as well as it does is because DreamWorks refused to let Ramses be a symbol. He's a person, and his wound is one of the most specific and recognizable wounds any animated villain has ever carried. He was told early in his life by the person whose opinion meant everything to him that he was the weak link. His father said it plainly, and from that moment forward, every single decision Ramses makes is a decision made by someone trying to prove that wrong. This is the thing about wounds that get delivered that early and that directly. They don't just hurt, they organize. They become the invisible architecture that every subsequent choice gets built on top of. Ramses becomes cruel because cruelty feels like strength, and strength is the only language he has for disproving what his father said. When Moses comes back and asks him to let the Israelites go, Ramses can't hear it as a moral question. He hears it as another test of whether he's strong enough, and he refuses, every time, through every plague, through losses that should have broken anyone, because the alternative isn't just losing to Moses. The alternative is proving his father right. That is the one thing he will burn everything to avoid.
But one weak link can break the chain of a mighty dynasty.
The most devastating moment in the film is at the end, when Moses stands on the other side of the Red Sea and Ramses screams his name, and you realize the scream isn't rage, it's grief. It's a man who lost his father, his son, his brother, and the only version of himself he knew how to be, all at once. He was a boy who was told he wasn't enough, who spent his whole life trying to answer that, and chose the wrong answer every time. That is not a cartoon villain, that is a human being. And the film never lets you forget that Moses loved him, that they grew up together, that before the mission and the plagues and the confrontation, there were two brothers who genuinely chose each other. The tragedy of Ramses isn't that he was evil, it's that he was loved and couldn't receive it, because the only love that mattered to him was the one his father withheld. That kind of wound doesn't heal just because someone else shows up and offers you something better. It calcifies. It becomes the lens through which every relationship gets interpreted, and DreamWorks put that on screen in 1998, which tells you everything about what this studio understood from very early on. Lord Farquaad is a different kind of right, and I want to be careful about how I say this, because Farquaad is easy to dismiss as a joke villain, a parody, a one-note gag about small men with large ambitions. On the surface, he is all of that. But there's a psychological truth buried underneath the parody that the film actually takes seriously, even when it wraps it in humor. Farquaad built Duloc. He didn't inherit it. He built it. He took a place and turned it into something pristine and controlled and perfect, where everything was exactly where it was supposed to be, and nothing messy or fairy tale creature shaped was allowed to exist. And he did this, as the film quietly implies, because he is himself the product of something messy. His father was a grumpy dwarf. His mother was a princess. He doesn't fit cleanly into any category the world has decided matters, and his response to that was to create a world where he got to decide which categories mattered, where he was the one setting the standard of perfection rather than failing to meet someone else's. That is a very specific and very human response to growing up feeling like you don't fit. You build the world that would have accepted you. You exile everything that reminds you of the parts of yourself you couldn't make acceptable. The fairy tale creatures aren't just an inconvenience to Farquaad, they're a mirror, and he cannot stand what he sees in it. The comedy is what lets the film show you something true about how this kind of compensation works, without making the audience sit in it long enough to feel implicated. But the implication is there. Farquaad isn't alien. He's recognizable. What the film is really showing you, underneath the jokes, is that the most ruthless kind of self-hatred is the kind that gets turned outward and dressed up as standards. Farquaad doesn't hate himself openly. He hates everything that represents the parts of himself he's rejected. He calls it order. He calls it perfection. He calls it building something worthy of a king. But strip the title away, and what you have is a man who was made to feel like he didn't belong, and responded by making it so nothing that reminded him of that feeling was allowed anywhere near him. That's not a fairy tale villain. That's a psychological portrait, and it works as a villain precisely because it never fully announces itself as one. The fairy godmother is where DreamWorks got genuinely sophisticated about what a villain can be, because she is the only villain in the Shrek franchise operating from a position of genuine love, twisted, controlling, destructive love, but love nonetheless. Everything she does, every scheme, every time she weaponizes her power, she does it for her son. Charming is going to get what he deserves. Charming is going to be king, and nothing and nobody is going to stand in the way of that. Here is what makes her genuinely terrifying. She is right that the system she's operating inside is rigged. She is right that happily ever afters are allocated unfairly, that who gets them has always been about who fits the approved image. She built her entire business on that truth. Her manipulation of Harold is a masterclass in exploiting someone's guilt and love simultaneously. She doesn't threaten him. She reminds him of the deal that was made. She reminds him that she gave him the thing he wanted most, and now she just wants the thing she was promised. That's not villainy in the cartoonish sense. That's a woman who learned exactly how the world works and decided to work it harder than anyone else. And what makes her fall so genuinely sad is that all of it was for nothing. She built an empire of manipulation to secure a future for someone who had no capacity to appreciate it. And in the end, her own spell is what destroys her. The love was real. The method was catastrophic. And DreamWorks let both of those things be true without resolving the tension. That's not something most animated films are willing to do. Tai Lung from Kung Fu Panda is the wound made flesh, and I want to spend real time here because I think Tai Lung is one of the most psychologically complete villains in the history of animation, and almost nobody talks about him with the seriousness he deserves. Tai Lung was chosen. That's the starting point, and it's essential. Shifu found him, raised him, poured everything he had into him and told him, through every action if not always through words, that he was destined for greatness. Shifu believed this so completely that when Oogway refused to confirm it, Shifu couldn't even advocate properly for the child he'd raised, because on some level, he knew that what Oogway saw in Tai Lung's eyes was real. There was darkness there, and Shifu had put it there, not through cruelty, but through the specific cruelty of raising someone on the promise of a destiny, and then failing to give them the emotional foundation to handle not receiving it. Tai Lung's wound is betrayal, not the betrayal of being denied the scroll, though that's what he points to. The deeper betrayal is that the person who raised him and told him he was enough, then stood there and said nothing when the world said he wasn't. He needed Shifu to fight for him. Shifu didn't, and 20 years in a prison designed specifically to contain him only calcified what was already forming.
I have come home, Master. This is no longer your home, and I am no longer your master.
The reason Tai Lung resonates so deeply is because his logic is airtight from inside his own perspective. He trained harder than anyone. He dedicated his entire life to the thing Shifu told him his life was supposed to be about. And then it was given to a panda who literally fell out of the sky. The injustice of that is real. Tai Lung isn't wrong that the system failed him. He's wrong about what to do with that, catastrophically wrong. But the wound itself is legitimate. And that's what makes him terrifying. You understand every step of how he got there. Lord Shen is Tai Lung's dark mirror, and in some ways, the more complete villain, because Shen's wound goes one layer deeper. Tai Lung was denied what he believed was his destiny. Shen destroyed his own destiny, trying to prevent a prophecy about it. The peacock, who will be defeated by a warrior of black and white. That's what the soothsayer told him. And rather than sitting with that uncertainty, Shen went out and committed genocide. He killed the pandas. He wiped out an entire people to prevent one person from existing, and in doing so, he set every event in motion that led to Po eventually defeating him. He fulfilled the prophecy by trying to stop it. This is the psychology of control, taken to its absolute terminus. Shen grew up watching the fireworks his family created get turned toward violence and destruction, a violence and destruction he engineered, and got exiled for it by the very parents he was trying to impress. His parents sent him away. He interpreted that as evidence that he was fundamentally unworthy of being kept, and from that point forward, he expanded his power over everything within reach, because control was the only language left that felt like safety. When Po finally defeats him, and the soothsayer asks him why he can't just stop, Shen's answer is the most honest thing he says in the entire film. He's been trying to outrun something that's already inside him. He can't stop, because stopping means sitting still long enough to feel what happened. He would rather die in the wreckage of everything he built than sit quietly with the truth that his parents sending him away broke something in him that no empire was ever going to fix. Shen wasn't pursuing power. He was fleeing grief. And DreamWorks let you see that clearly enough to feel it, without ever letting him off the hook for what he did. What makes Shen's story the one that hits hardest on rewatch is that his parents didn't send him away because they stopped loving him. They sent him away because they didn't know what else to do. The exile was an act of desperation from people who were themselves incapable of handling what he'd become. And Shen never knew that. He only knew the outcome, which was that he was gone, and they stayed. And he spent the rest of his life building an answer to a question they never actually asked. That gap between what a wound actually meant and what the person who carries it believes it meant is where most real human damage lives. DreamWorks put that on screen in a Kung Fu sequel and trusted a 10-year-old to feel it, even if they couldn't name it yet. Grimmel from How to Train Your Dragon. The hidden world operates on a different psychological register than every villain we've talked about so far, and that difference is what makes him uniquely unsettling. Ramses, Tai Lung, Shen, the fairy Godmother, all of them are driven by wounds you can trace. Grimmel doesn't have a wound you can trace. Grimmel looked at the world, understood it clearly, and made a choice. He killed a Night Fury as a child, not because he was threatened, because he could, because it was the most dangerous dragon alive, and eliminating it made him exceptional. And from that point forward, he built an entire identity on that single defining act. That's not a wound, that's a vocation. And what makes him terrifying is precisely that he doesn't need a wound to justify what he does. He just believes that the world is a hierarchy and he belongs at the top of it. And he pursues that belief with the calm, methodical patience of someone who has never once questioned whether it's correct. Grimmel is what happens when intelligence gets completely uncoupled from empathy. He sees Hiccup's bond with Toothless, and rather than being moved by it, he analyzes it as a vulnerability to exploit. That's evil born of a worldview that never had room for anything it couldn't use, and the film is honest enough to show you that his worldview isn't entirely wrong about the world as it is, only about what the world should be, and only Hiccup's choice to build something different proves him wrong. Grimmel's defeat is the defeat of a coherent philosophy by a better one. That's rare in animation, and it gives the third film a weight most people don't fully register until years later. The most chilling thing about Grimmel is how reasonable he sounds. He's not ranting. He's not consumed by rage or grief or wounded pride. He explains his position calmly, with the confidence of someone who has simply never encountered a compelling counter-argument. He genuinely believes that the world he's fighting for is the right one. That's the thing that separates him from every other villain in this conversation. The others were right about their wound. Grimmel is right about nothing, and he doesn't know it. And that particular combination of certainty and wrongness is something the real world produces far more often than fiction usually admits. Megamind is the experiment, the one where DreamWorks asks the question every other villain story circles without quite asking directly. What if we followed the villain all the way through and found out what's on the other side? Megamind was told from the beginning that he was the bad guy, not through one formative rejection, but through consistent and total institutional confirmation that this was his role. He arrived on Earth the same way Metro Man did, a refugee from a dying world, and Metro Man landed in a mansion, and Megamind landed in a prison. That was the world sorting them before they had any say in the matter. And when you get sorted into the villain category before you've made a single choice, you either spend your entire life fighting it, or you master it. Megamind chose mastery. He became the greatest villain Metro City had ever seen, not because he wanted destruction, but because villainy was the one arena where his intellect and creativity could be an asset rather than a liability. And then Metro Man faked his death and walked away, and Megamind won, and the win felt like nothing, because the entire architecture of meaning he'd built required an opponent to define himself against. Without Metro Man, the villain identity collapsed into meaninglessness, and what was left underneath was just a person who had never been given permission to figure out who he actually was when nobody was watching. The film is the story of him figuring out that all of that was a story he'd been told so many times he stopped questioning it. And it works because DreamWorks took the premise seriously enough to follow it all the way through, to show you that the villain label was always a cage, and that the question of who you are underneath the identity you've been performing is the same question anyone asks when that identity stops working. DreamWorks just dressed it in a cape and trusted you to feel the real thing underneath. And then there is death, from Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. Death deserves the last word here because death is the culmination of everything DreamWorks understood about what a villain can be, distilled into its purest form. Death doesn't have a wound. Death doesn't want power or recognition or revenge. Death just is. He exists as the natural consequence of every choice Puss ever made, the accumulation of every burned life, every reckless adventure, every moment where Puss treated his own existence as something inexhaustible. He shows up as a wolf because a wolf is what you send after something that's running out of time, and Puss has been running his whole life without ever acknowledging what he's running from. What makes death genuinely terrifying in a way no DreamWorks villain before him achieved is that he never pretends to be something he isn't. He doesn't manipulate or scheme. He just keeps walking, patient, unhurried, present in a way that Puss has spent 8 lifetimes refusing to be. He whistles. He enjoys the pursuit. He is, in the most unsettling possible way, content. And his contentment in the face of Puss's terror is the whole psychological thesis of the film. The thing you are most afraid of doesn't care how afraid you are. It's coming regardless. The only question is what you do with the time before it arrives.
Death, and I've come for you, Puss in Boots.
When Puss finally stops running and turns and stands, death doesn't become defeatable in the conventional sense. He acknowledges the choice. He tips his hat. He walks away. What the film is telling you in that moment is that death was never really the enemy. Fear of death was the enemy. The life half-lived, because you couldn't bear to be present in it, was the enemy. Death was just the mirror that finally made Puss look at himself clearly enough to choose differently. That's not a villain in any traditional sense. That's an honest reckoning with what we spend our lives avoiding, and why the avoidance costs us more than the thing itself ever would. The thread that runs through every single one of these characters is that DreamWorks never built their villains from the outside in. They built them from the inside out. Every one of them starts from a place you can understand, a wound, or a worldview, or a choice that has its own internal logic, and then shows you how that logic, unchecked and turned outward rather than inward, produces devastation. They were broken in ways the world recognized too late, or not at all, and the breaking produced what the stories needed, an antagonist who forces the hero to confront something real. And I think that's the thing Disney lost and DreamWorks held onto. Disney's villains, at their weakest, are obstacles. They exist to be defeated, so the hero can get what they deserve. DreamWorks villains exist to ask a question. What would the hero have become if one or two things had gone differently? Tai Lung is who Po could have been if Shifu had failed him the way Shifu failed Tai Lung. Shen is who Po could have been if he'd never found his family. Megamind is what Hiccup might have become if the village had never softened toward him. The villain isn't separate from the hero's story. The villain is the hero's story, told from a different starting point. The distance between a villain and a person who finds another way is not as large as we want it to be. It's a question of what you do with the pain when it arrives, whether you turn it into something that destroys other people, or whether you find someone willing to sit with you in it long enough to help you build something else. Ramses needed someone to tell him the weak link thing was wrong. Tai Lung needed Shifu to fight for him. Shen needed his parents to stay. The fairy godmother needed to love her son in a way that left room for him to fail. Megamind needed someone to tell him the prison wasn't his destiny. They didn't get those things. The heroes did. And that, more than any magical power or evil scheme, is what actually makes a DreamWorks villain work. They show you what a person becomes when the thing everyone needs and almost nobody gets, the thing of being truly seen and chosen anyway, never arrives, and they make you feel the weight of that absence in a way that stays with you long after the credits roll. And you're supposed to be done thinking about an animated film. You're not done. You never really are. That's the whole point. These films were never really about the villains. They were about what the villains reveal, which is that the line between someone who finds their way and someone who doesn't is drawn long before the story starts, in the small moments nobody writes down, in the things that were said or withheld, in the presence or absence of one person willing to see you clearly and stay anyway. DreamWorks understood that, and they built it into every villain they ever made worth remembering.